The first thing I did was to print all of the plans and bring them out to my shop so I could work from those. Then I took the time to carefully cut all of the parts out and drilled the countersinks for all of the screws. If you would like to build this yourself, the plans are available and there's a link to them in the description of this video. The first assembly step is to fasten part B to part A. I'm using brad nails to keep the parts in line until I get the holes drilled for the screws. Then I can drive the screws in. Next, I'll put some glue in the junction between parts A and B and fasten part C in place with more screws. When this is put together, it should be nice and straight, and you want to check it now at this point, because if it's crooked, you really need to fix that before you move on. Next up is the fence rail itself, and that's just 2 pieces of 1/2-inch plywood glued and clamped together, parts D1 and D2. I'm going to set both of these aside to dry for now and work on other things. After the glue dries on the fence rail, you want to clean up any squeeze out, and then I'm going to attach it to the rail assembly temporarily to get it lined up. Here I'm using blocks of plywood that I cut to 1 inch wide to use as spacers between the rail and the angled assembly. To attach the fence rail, I'm using screws with washers. But first I need to drill a pilot hole, and that has to be roughly centered in that 3/8 inch hole. The 3/8 inch holes are there to allow for adjustment of the fence rail back and forth. That's how you'll adjust the fence itself square to the table. The screws I'm using are 1.5 inches long, and with the washers, they'll stop just short of poking through the top side of the fence rail. You don't use any glue here in this joint because that rail will have to be adjusted later on. Pointer is easy to make. It's just a piece of thin hardwood that I've cut the size and drilled elongated holes in the ends so that I could mount it with screws and adjust it afterwards. The pointer itself just gets glued to the pointer base and then set aside to dry. Now I can get working on the fence itself, starting with the T, and that's made up of parts E, F, and G. So the first step is to attach part E to part F with glue and screws. Once again, I'm using brads just to make sure everything stays lined up. When those are assembled, I can glue on part G, clamp it up, and set it aside to dry. This has to be strong, so I'm putting a lot of glue in there to make sure I've got complete coverage. One of the few metal parts in the build is the rub plate. I'm using 1/8 inch thick aluminum for that, although you can use steel as well. If you don't have anything that's 1/8 of an inch thick, you can use something a little bit thinner, but you may have to make some adjustments for it to work properly. I'm using my small belt sander to get rid of the burrs left over from cutting it out with the hacksaw, although you can use a file as well. Assembly step 4 is to attach part H to the T assembly using glue and 2 screws. These 2 parts have to be reasonably square to one another, so what I'm going to do here is line it up, clamp it, then I'm going to use my square to line it up as best as I can. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but it needs to be close. Then I'm going to drill the pilot holes through the screws, take the clamp off, and put glue in the joint. Then I can dry the screws and check it again with the square to make sure that it's still square. You'll be able to make small adjustments here before the glue dries. While the glue is drying on those parts, I can get the rub plate fastened. Just going to mark out where the hole goes, drill a pilot hole, and dry the screw. It's a good idea at this point to measure the distance between the rub plate and the back side of the T, and that should match pretty closely or be a little bit more than the width of your fence rail. If it's too tight, you can always cut a little bit off the fence rail to make it fit. Now is a good time to attach the pointer, and I use it to mark out the holes and then fasten it with screws and washers. The cam handle is probably the most difficult part in the whole thing to make. but I'm going to try to show it here in a simple way. I start with 2 pieces of plywood that will make up the handle, and they're 1/2 inch thick. I want to draw a line down the center, then make a mark that's 5 3/4 of an inch from the end. This is the center point for the pivot hole, but I need to draw another center that's 1/16 of an inch below that line, and that will be the center point of the outside part of the cam. Now I've got my compact compass set to the radius of the cam, and that's 1 inch. Now for the handle itself, I'll draw one line that's 3/8 of an inch from the center line and 5/8 of an inch from the center line. And I'll just use something that's roughly the right round shape to round over the corners. Then I'm going to fasten it to the other blank with a couple of brads, just temporarily, so that I can drill the hole through both at the same time. When I'm cutting it out, I'm staying away from the line because I want to fine-tune it on the disc sander and the spindle sander. Before I get into shaping the handle, I'm going to glue the 2 parts together, and I'm going to use the 5/8 inch bolt to make sure that they're lined up correctly. Assembly step 6 is to attach L1 and L2 to part H with glue and screws again. Once more, I'm using brads to hold the parts in line while I get the screws in. When I cut out parts J1, J2, K1, and K2, I took the time to mark a line across so that they're all oriented the same way so that they don't get mixed up when I put them in. Even though it would be great if you could put the hole exactly in the center of these parts when you drill them out, that seldom will happen with woodworking tools, so this avoids any misalignment. I just want to pay attention when I'm putting them in to make sure they're oriented the same way. Since 1/2 inch plywood is rarely actually 1/2 inch thick, you may have to make some shims to go between the cam handle and parts K1 and K2. I made mine from thin aluminum flashing, but you could also use plastic like from a pop bottle. Right here I'm cutting the threads off of the bolt. I only want the shank part of it, the round part. This doesn't have any threads on it. Then I'll slip it back in the hole to measure it and then cut it off to that length. We're getting very close to the end of assembly here now. There's only a couple more steps to do. The first is to attach part M to the top of the fence assembly. Once again, I'm using brads to keep the parts in line until I can get the screws put in. The final assembly step is to attach parts I1 and I2 to the fence assembly. I'm not going to be using any screws for this, just glue and a couple of brads to hold it in place until I can get it clamped up. After I finished putting the fence together, I brought everything inside because it's still a little bit too cold in my shop here. And I gave everything 2 coats of water-based polyurethane. And what that does is it protects it and also makes it work a bit smoother. Although it's really smooth, I gotta say. Really works well. Like I said in the opening, if you would like to build one of your own, there's a set of plans available, very easy to follow. And the link to those is in the description. I also made a video showing how I took off the old fence and put on the new one, and that's on my other channel. The link to that video is also in the description. Well, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.